Okay, let's start. Assalamu'alaikum and good morning to our key speakers in Florida, California. Good morning to all here in Europe, and hello, salam to everybody. Salam to Marielle and salam to Murat. They are joining us online.
Alaikum assalam.
First of all, let me thank you all for joining this lecture by Milestones Journal today. This is a joint event between Milestones, the first joint event between Milestones Journal and Dar Al Janub. Some technical details for all of you. Our speakers are very enduring workers, so it could take a long time. After the lecture, all participants should have the possibility to ask questions. Please wave your hand that we can see that someone wants to talk, or write in the chat. My name is Markus Scholz from Dar Al Janub. And again, Assalamu'alaikum to Isra Ibrahim, Tanzin Doha, and Hannibal Shakur.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Now I will introduce our key speakers in this lecture. Isra Ibrahim is an activist organizer based in South Florida. She was a student organizer for Florida International University Students for Justice in Palestine chapter. Through SJP, she was active in anti-Zionist, anti-war movements. She organized student walkouts and an apartheid war demonstration. She also mobilized the Solidarity Action for Detained Somalis initiative with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration at the Chrome Detention Center in response to the ICE detainment of 92 Somalis and Sudanese migrants. She is currently a media analyst for Milestones Journal. Thank you, Isra.
Thank you.
Hannibal Shakur plays an important role in political organizing in Auckland's Black and Muslim communities. He was one of the central organizers of the Auckland campaigns and protests that launched the following the assassination of Oscar Grant by a BART police officer in the early morning hours of the new year 2009. In 2011 and 2012, helped provide security for the Occupy Auckland main camp. In 2012, Hannibal, along with other brothers and sisters, organized the Hoodie and Hijab March in Auckland, California, on the 11th anniversary of the war in Afghanistan. In addition, Hannibal made several strategic interventions into the white supremacy and anti-blackness that persisted in and was being perpetrated by so-called radical allies. I hope we can hear more about these subjects called radical allies. One such intervention led to the founding of Quilombo, a community social center in West Auckland. Hannibal utilized his time in Quilombo organizing protests against police terror and building institutions, for example, liberated Leather Soap, Operation Africa Town, etc., for Black self-reliance. In late 2014, Hannibal Shakur shifted towards working more specifically through an Islamic lens. Hannibal is active in one mosque and helping a project to open another, Auckland Islamic Community Center, and the tentative Vallejo, California Masjid. Hannibal is a special contributor and researcher for the Milestones Collective. Thank you, Hannibal. Tanzin Doha is an anthropologist of Islam and secularism. As an anthropologist, Tanzin studies the impact of the localized war on terror in Bangladesh, his home country, and collects data on the disappearance and killings of Islamic practitioners. In the US, over the course of the last 20 years, Tanzin worked as an organizer to establish connections between anti-war, anti-capitalist, and anti-Zionist struggles. Tanzin has been active in protests, occupations, blockades, strikes, and riots in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2009, Zimmerman's acquittal in 2013, and the Israeli bombing of Gaza in 2014. Most recently, Tanzin participated in the uprising in Minneapolis in response to the brutal killing of George Floyd. Hannibal, Abdul Shakur, and Tanzeen Rashidor, also known as the Traven II, were arrested in Connecticut in connection with a 2013 protest of George Zimmerman's not guilty verdict in the murder of Trayvon Martin. The Alameda County District Attorney's Office charged both defendants with felony vandalism despite no evidence they engaged in such conduct. The district attorney finally dropped the charge against them for lack of evidence. The Traven II, along with their legal team, received the Black Lives Matter Award from the NLG in 2015. So, definitely, our key speakers are real troublemakers. Let me short introduce Milestone's Journal. Milestone's Journal publishes articles, reviews, interviews, documents, podcasts, photo essays, and other materials that are not available in conventional secular media. Milestones offers commentary on theology, ethics, and contemporary politics that influence and affect the Islamic world. They publish articles, reviews, interviews, documents, podcasts, photo essays, and other materials that are not available in a conventional secular media. As a site, Milestones perform two main functions: providing a meaningful infrastructure for an ongoing discourse of Islam, facilitating a platform for the deconstruction of Western hegemonic system and analyzes epistemologies, political cultures, and moral sensibilities. On the first view, everybody can see how this journal permanently leaves Western discourses and questions these debates. Milestone's Journal confronts the people with their perspective of the Global South. Please visit their homepage and follow the discussions under www.milestonesjournal.net. Let me short introduce Dar Al Janub, Union for Anti-Racism and Peace Policy. Dar Al Janub is an initiative based in Vienna, Austria, and was founded in 2003 when the Second Intifada came to a specific point. The occupation of Iraq began and the war against the people of Afghanistan began. One main goal of Dar Al Janub is to present and discuss concepts and visions of liberation by activists and scholars in the Global South. Dar Al Janub works outside of the institutions, has a community center, and makes fact-finding missions to occupied Palestine. Since 2017, Dar Al Janub has a permanent discussion with Daruba al-Mujahid bin Wahab, former member of the Black Panther Party and Black Liberation Army. This discussion has deep impact on Dar Al Janub's work and found its expression in two visits from him to Europe. If you want to know more about our work, visit our homepage. This lecture today is part of a series called Rethink Anti-Colonial Power in Islam and Islamism. In the first part, we studied in a group the Malcolm X speech, Message to the Grassroots. In the second part, we listened to a lecture by Amir Abdel Malik about Black Muslim history. The third part is now this lecture by Milestones, the Wolf and the Fox, Message from the Grassroots on American Muslim Leadership. We began with the message to the grassroots, and now we will end with the message from the grassroots. And some of us are well prepared. So welcome again to this lecture. It is a great pleasure to have you all three here with us, Hannibal, Tanzeen, Isra, with activists and workers in Milestone's Journal. The topic of today, The Wolf and the Fox, Message from the Grassroots on American Muslim Leadership, an essay from 2019, written by our key speakers. We can read in the abstract, I quote, "Instead of assuming categorical and essential differences a priori, the state and civil society mobilize resources, institutions, and technologies of power to forcibly make Islam compatible with and subservient to American interests. There are epistemic, material, and ontological consequences of this violence that is essential for the construction of American Islam as a category and American Muslim as an identity. What kinds of American Muslim leaders are necessary for these constructions? We follow Malcolm X typologies to extract a broad understanding of the characters in leadership that sustain the American project. Quote end. This sounds familiar when we look at the construction and invention of a so-called Euro-Islam, European Islam, or an Islam integrated in the European project. Dear key speakers, your experience from the grassroots are important for work on the ground here in Europe. We want to discover similarities and try to learn. So please start. I would suggest Hannibal could begin, but it's up to you who wants to begin.
I can definitely start. First of all, thank you.
Yes, please start, Isra. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for those introductions, Marcus. On behalf of Milestones, I'd like to, express my gratitude towards you and Dar Al Janub for taking the initiative to reach out to us to have this wider conversation during this historical moment. So, like you said before, the topic of our lecture is on our 2019 article that we co-wrote called "The Wolf and the Fox: Message from the Grassroots to American Muslim Leadership." Before we get into the larger critiques we made in the article, it's important to establish and understand the specific circumstances in which the article came about. So in 2019, when Trump was president, the Trump administration created this 10-member Human Rights Commission to look at the role of human rights in US foreign policy. So Hamza Yusuf, one of the most celebrated and well-known Muslim scholars of the Western Hemisphere, publicly joined this commission. And it's important to note here that because the Muslim ban was such a hallmark of the Trump presidency, Hamza Yusuf joining the Trump administration's commission added this increased emotional intensity to the political discourse at the time. And so obviously, this prompted a lot of very loud, very swift negative responses from many activists, scholars, and imams. And the overall consensus was basically that Hamza Yusuf was joining a fascist administration. Others stated that Hamza Yusuf had a long history of aligning himself with the political right. And so joining the Trump administration was already normalized, was soon to be coming, and we shouldn't have been surprised about this anyway. I think for us on Milestones, it was significant, and it is still significant to observe how organizations, groups, leaders within the American Muslim political landscape responds to certain political events, and specifically this political event. Because what the spectrum of those reactions and responses can tell us, it can tell us the political orientations, the political positions of those said people. So we decided to write our article not because the responses to Hamza Yusuf were incorrect, but because they were simply inadequate. They weren't enough. The majority of these reactions and responses identify the root of the issue to be one singular of Trump, a problem of the political right, and they did not identify the root of the issue to be one of America, one of the American empire. So I think this is where the main contradiction of mainstream American activism, mainstream Muslim American activism lies. It's this contradiction of constantly utilizing radical language, radical political critique of America as a response to the abuses to the state, as responses to the political right, and they don't actually critique the state form of empire itself. And this is slowly how activism, especially within the global north, is utilized to validate and maintain the larger settler state, which is America. That's maintained by both the right and the left. So they play very two important functions here. And so for American Muslims, it's this larger question of forcing Islam into American politics to fit into the interests of empire. What do we gain from transforming ourselves into good Muslims with a quiet politic that don't actually challenge the state form that is America? Or most importantly, what are the types of leaders that are required to perform and maintain this American empire? Or to be said another way, if there are American Muslim communities who are basically committed to forcing Islam to be subservient to the interests of empire, then we should expect that there will be leaders that come up today and tomorrow that will basically come to respond to that social base and perform those important functions. So this is really the crux of the intervention that us as Milestones really wanted to perform in the public sphere. If you go back to our title, The Wolf and the Fox, this is a specific analysis that we use from Malcolm X to help us identify two types of leaders based on how they engage with the state and how their function actually helps to preserve the American project. For Hamza Yusuf, we use the example, the category of the wolf. And as Malcolm explains, the wolf describes the enemy that is open and direct. It describes the open racists who are enthusiastic about their white supremacy, who are very enthusiastic about their engagement with the state. And because they are openly enthusiastic, it's not difficult to discern what their political and ideological orientations are. So for us, we use the category, the type of the wolf from Malcolm X to describe Hamza Yusuf, because like stated before, Hamza Yusuf has had a long history of aligning himself with the political right. On multiple times, he would have like white nativist positions. He once stated that if you hate the West, then go immigrate to a Muslim country. And he's been very enthusiastic about his engagement with the state. So for us, discerning Hamza Yusuf's political and ideological orientation is very easy because it's just simply very clear. So I would say that the most controversial part of our article came to our discussion of the fox, because simply put, it just implicated a lot more people, and it still does to this day. So when we look at Malcolm's comparison, he states that the fox is more difficult to identify because the politics of the fox is unclear, it's confusing, and it's also ambiguous. He says one thing and he does something else. So I want to quote Malcolm's direct analysis here to identify and clarify the distinctions a little bit better. Malcolm says, the white conservatives aren't friends of the Negro, but they at least don't try to hide it. They are like wolves. They show their teeth in a snarl that keeps the Negro always aware of where he stands with them, but the white liberals are foxes, who also show their teeth to the Negro, but pretend they are smiling. The white liberals are more dangerous than the conservatives. They lure the Negro, and as the Negro runs from the growling wolf, he flees into the open jaws of the smiling fox. And I think from Malcolm's quote here, we can conclude that he's stating that the fox is a lot more dangerous because of how confusing and ambiguous their politics are. And I think this is really relevant today because if we look at the dominant political ideology, which is liberalism, it produces so many within movements, people who have a lot of ambiguous politics, and people who are categorically the fox. We have more foxes within the movement than there are wolves. And at the height of such confusions that these foxes produces, and it basically disorganizes movements and it leaves our resources exhausted. So back to the controversy. So just as we identified Hamza Yusuf as playing the function of the wolf within American Muslim leadership, we also wanted to give an example of the fox because we just owed it to be to kind of offer ethical and principled observations and to be clear of what we meant. And so one of the most admired and also well-known American imams is Imam Omar Suleiman, who has been popularized as a clergy of the streets, someone who's willing to challenge the status quo, which is all good and fine. The problem and confusion arises when he also proclaims in the same breath that he loves America and that he wants America to be better because I love what this country stands for. So as someone who proclaims publicly to be a student of Malcolm X, it's you can't then support American ideals. Um, Also worth noting that Omar Suleiman is also the same person who led a 2016 memorial service for police officers, in which he stated that he was against police brutality, but he wasn't against police officers. So he wasn't actually against the institution of policing, which the American empire basically utilizes as its internal military. So that in itself is in direct opposition to the legacy of Malcolm X. It's a complete misreading of history. And to be completely honest, it ultimately pacifies the brutal imperialism and colonialism of the larger settler state that America purports like on the daily. So I think this is the larger critique and intervention that we want to continue on making from Milestones, which is this, is that the liberal left, the liberal left, which produces so many foxes, is so focused on the harms committed by the political right that they not only conveniently ignore the fact that America is the settler colonial empire, but many times actually insist on America's inherent good. They insist that they are actually good Americans. And I think a recent example of this was the attacks at the Capitol just a few weeks ago before Biden's inauguration. Because it was Trump supporters that attacked the Capitol, the response from the mainstream liberal left was basically to proclaim, oh no, those are the bad Americans, we are the good Americans. Ultimately, at the end of the day, validating and maintaining, preserving the American project itself. So we're going back to this contradiction, which is like circular and process and continues to be reinforced. And it's also like every election cycle, it's this delusion, this political delusion that continues to be purported of like, you know, America being a work in progress, this immature racist that will grow up. And that is kind of the position that has been maintained within like, you know, the larger liberal left within America. And so the supposed tension between the mainstream left and the right, it gives us this illusion that there's such a large political difference between them. But ultimately, both the right and the left, they play important opposite functions to preserve the American project. And what's important to note here is that even though we're critiquing the leaders, we're critiquing American Muslim leadership, we also need to remind ourselves that the reason that these leaders exist, because there does exist within the global north, within the West, Muslim American communities who are interested in forcing Islam to be subservient to the interests of empire. And that's why these leaders continue to come up. And I think that's also the question we asked within our article is what type of transformation are American Muslims attempting and at what cost? What are they becoming? What are their new political categories? And so these are very important questions we really need to consider. And how should we think of solidarity with the global South and with the Islamic South? So from here, I want to open it up to my colleagues to also join in with the discussion as well and add to several points made.
Thank you, Isra. Yeah, please. Guys?
Yeah, I
yes.
mean, you know, just to kind of follow up on that too, and to really get at the core of the issue, which is the kind of confusion that they create with this idea of, you know, this internal battle of America. You know, the idea is that, you know, there's these two polar opposite forces who are, you know, who are battling it out for the soul and the morals of America. But the reality is that it's more of a 1-2 punch. You know, it's sort of like, you know, they jab you with liberalism and then they give you the hook with the extreme brutality of the military power, you know. And so when you encroach on the ideological grounding and underpinning of the colonial imperial project, and a project to make one small group of people supremely powerful over everyone else, over the rest of the world, when you start to encroach on the underpinnings, on the legitimacy and the foundations of these values and the direction of this entity, the direction that is going, the trajectory of history that cannot be argued with, regardless of where we want to speculate where we're at right now, and you know what exciting new possibilities have come with, you know, Biden and Harris. If you know, we can speculate all day, but before we get into speculation and we just look at the trajectory and the history and the historical flow and direction that this entity of America has moved throughout history, then we have to deal with the reality. We have to deal with the reality that it's a colonial empire, right? And so when we question that and when we encroach upon that, they send for us these confusion mongers. You know, Frantz Fanon called them confusion mongers. And these are people who come in and they play at the emotions of people. They play at the aspirations of people, at the hopelessness of situations. They offer false hope in a system that's not only incapable of providing equality or justice, but completely uninterested, historically, completely uninterested in being just, being fair, equal, or any of the purported, you know, higher values of America, right? This idea of the melting pot, this idea of, you know, the immigrant nation where everyone's equal, and all of these false notions of, you know, the moral superiority of this liberal democracy. You know, when we begin to take that apart and when we begin to analyze that for what it is, they send for us people who they utilize sort of like this it's like a entertainment aspect. You know, it's a show that they put on, right? And you know, one of the things that you'll see with a lot of these celebrity influencers, like celebrity imams and scholars, is that it's a feel good type of thing. The whole point of their speech or their class or their sermon, what have you, the whole point is to placate people by making them feel good, making them feel that there's some progress taking place, making them feel that the situation is not as bad as it actually is, making them feel as if, you know, their mere wishful thinking is all that's required to change the situation. It's just for them to have wishful thinking, a positive mindset, and, you know, continue to love humanity and love everyone. And you know, this kind of liberal fallacy that, you know, this liberal kind of love for everyone is going to overcome the ignorance of the oppressor, you know. And historically, the reality is that, you know, they're using these people to manipulate us, to give pause to us when we come to a point of being able to hold them accountable. When we get organized, we get our heads together, we get clarity of mind, and we begin to kind of orient ourselves towards our real obstacles and problems, then they send for us these people who they want to draw us into these individualistic, you know, these individualistic paths of you know, my own personal struggle. You know, I'm on my own personal individual struggle, and I'm just, you know, I'm battling against negativity, and I'm battling against, you know, corruption just by being more polite to everyone. So when I'm on the BART train and when I'm on the bus, I'm more polite to everyone, and my politeness is overcoming the drones and the tanks and the military industrial complex of America, you know. And you know, for a lot of people who come to a point of questioning the order of the world, questioning the way that the world is currently structured, it can be overwhelming and exhausting to think about. It can be very overwhelming to think about trying to make change, to think about trying to take responsibility to actually change a system that's so brutal already. It's so brutal in maintaining status quo. So one can imagine what's going to happen if you try to push back, right? And so for a lot of people, the mere thought of resistance overwhelms them. People get crippled by fear. People get, you know, crippled by ignorance and not knowing, like, you know, what direction do I even start in if I want to do something different? Who do I turn to to work together with, and you know, who can I rely on to do this? People get overwhelmed. It can be very, very overwhelming, and this is what they're taking advantage of when they come along and tell people, well, you know, all you got to do is make dua, you know, because dua is the weapon of the believer, and that's it. Yes, dua is the weapon of the believer, and duas are very powerful. Our duas are very powerful, but that's not the extent of what we're capable of, right? That's definitely a very, very important tool at our disposal, but we have to think very realistically what's at our means, what we have power over, what we have influence over, what we're capable of as people, right? And it's an important thing that I want to reiterate to people. When we think of ourselves as oppressed people, poor people, colonized people, etc., a lot of times we think we don't have the power or energy to overcome our obstacles, etc. But we have to remember that we are the ones holding up the current structure of the world. We are the ones who are driving the machine every day. We are the fuel. We are the force that's driving capitalism because we're the workforce. We're the labor. We are the ones who carry out the difficult tasks every day of maintaining the system. And the fundamental problem is that we don't come together enough. We don't have enough clarity when we come together. We don't have enough clear leadership when we come together to make proper use of what's at our disposal, right? And the reason that we can't make proper use of what we're capable of is because we have individuals who come in as confusion mongers precisely at the moment when people are motivated to change things, when people are angry enough, frustrated enough, in enough pain, in enough suffering to finally say, I'll take some more physical pain in order to change the situation. I'm ready for more pain to change the situation because it's come to a point where I can't accept it the way it is. That's when the confusion monger comes in. That's when the confusion monger comes in to point people in 5 different directions, to cast confusion among us that we can argue with each other, we can doubt each other, we can fight over what's the right approach, and we don't make use of it. And then before you know it, the energy dissipates, and we no longer have that drive to change things. And I know that's abstract, so I want to give a concrete example. One concrete example is when a young African American Muslim brother was killed here in Sacramento, California. The people, the protesters, began protesting immediately. Once the brother was killed, he was unarmed, and I believe he was shot in the back. And it was a situation where it was obviously unnecessary to shoot this brother. It wasn't even like any there wasn't any question. They could have dealt with this brother totally different. Anyway, the protesters, as soon as the news went out that the police had killed his brother, Stephon Clark, protests spontaneously started to erupt in Sacramento. And they got the notion, which was very, very intelligent. I don't know, whoever, I wish I knew the person's name to really give them the credit, and the people who were specifically responsible for carrying out this agenda, because these people were very sharp. They were intelligent, and they managed to overcome the liberal confusion. And what they did was they were able to organize and mobilize a group of protesters to strategically blockade the NBA stadium during playoffs. So this was a time when the kind of energy around Black Lives Matter was kind of waning, actually. And there wasn't a whole lot of activity at the time. And the whole country had just really shifted focus in the news from Black Lives Matter protests to NBA and NBA playoffs. And they were able to strategically siege the stadium and blockade the stadium during the playoffs. So they literally held the playoffs hostage by a handful of unarmed young Black protesters. And of course, absolutely, of course, it made national news. And it galvanized and recharged the energy of the protesters across the country. And everyone was saying the name of Stephon Clark. It was a potent move. It was a move that was very powerful. It was like they hit a pressure point, because in terms of the actual activity, what they did, it was fairly simple. It was fairly quick, and it had a maximum impact, to the point that the powers that be and the elite, their mechanisms started getting in place. How are we going to suppress these people who just took our playoffs hostage? They just took our NBA playoffs hostage. How can we allow that? Well, how can we fight it? And they said to the Big Six, like Malcolm talked about in Message to the Grassroots, they said, you got to stop it. You got to call it off. And what the Big Six said, they said, we can't stop it because we're not a part of it. And that's what happened in Sacramento, because they didn't have any of their strategic liberal Black Lives Matter agenda within that chapter in Sacramento. They had taken a particularly radical stance, even different from a lot of the other Black Lives Matter chapters, right? And so they had to send people in to infiltrate and manipulate the situation to kill that energy before it picked up any more momentum. And the way that they chose to deal with that was like a two-pronged approach, if you will. So they bring in, first and foremost, they bring in the celebrities. They bring in the people who are really good at, entertaining the masses, pulling at the heartstrings of the masses, of the people, and people who are good at saying a lot of fiery words that really don't add up to much. And who did they bring in? They brought in Al Sharpton, okay? And next to Al Sharpton was Omar Suleiman and Zaid Shakir. And their specific agenda and message was not, okay, it's time to organize the community. We've had enough of this violence by oppressors. We've had enough of this extrajudicial assassination and murder of Black people. We've had enough of this, and we're here to support the community in their demand for justice. No, that wasn't their message. That wasn't the role that they chose to play. Their message was unity with the oppressors. Their message was, we have to love our oppressors. We're all human beings, and therefore we can't acknowledge and deal with the issues of race. We can't acknowledge and deal with the issues of police abuses and the level of power that police have, that each individual police has, to the freedom they have to go around harming people with impunity, and the fact that they're above the law. And that wasn't, they didn't want to talk about none of that. They didn't want to talk about how injustice corrupts a society. They didn't want to talk about how, in our tradition of Islam, we're taught that injustice that is allowed to stand will collapse the whole society. They don't want to talk about that. They don't want to advise us on, the wisdom that one can only assume that they should have or would have, given their studies and, experiences as imams, etc. That one could think that there would be so much that could advise us on how to organize ourselves, how to lift ourselves up. But their message wasn't that. Their message was, that ultimately we have to calm down these tensions between the people and the police. Ultimately, it's not about race. It's not an issue of race. These are individual situations. These are accidents, etc. Their message was, calm down. We hear you. We understand you're upset that people are getting murdered, but calm down and stay in your place as oppressed slave classes. Don't rise up. This isn't Islamic thing to do. It's not the Islamic thing to do for you to rise up and hold oppressors accountable. The Islamic thing to do is to, find a way in your heart to forgive them and to love them after they're killing children, after they're killing innocent people, after they're taking fathers and mothers away from their children. Find it in your heart to forgive them, even though they don't get charged, they don't get held accountable by the law, they keep their jobs, they go on vacations, they get pay raises and all that. But it's your job to find it in your heart to forgive them and to love them, and that's what makes you a good Muslim. This is what they want to teach us. This is what they want to teach us, And so, I kind of talked a little bit abstractly about that. But if we look at that historical example, and it's such a good example because so much of it's on video. So much of that situation is observable. You can study it. You can go on YouTube and watch the videos of, Stephon Clark's eulogy. You can look at the series of events to how they shut down the NBA stadium. You can look at the role that people chose to play, right? And so that was the funeral. And now we expect at a funeral that, a family is grieving and people want there to be a degree of peace. They want to get through the events of the funeral without too much, without too much fiascos, without too much drama, because they're grieving, they're in a lot of pain. And it's hard, especially to lose a loved one in such a way. So, we expect that for the funeral, they want things to be very peaceful and smooth, etc. But the community itself, the frustration, the tension, the passion was still there. So one could expect after the funeral, maybe a day later, a couple of days later, there would be more protests, more activity. But these guys who gave eulogies and came in as celebrities to speak on the issue of Stephon Clark, bring in another celebrity. Who is it? It's Matt Barnes. Matt Barnes from the NBA. And Matt Barnes is so affected that he's going to individually come and pay for a peace march. He's going to pay for a peace march as if the protesters have been violent, as if the marches and protests weren't already peaceful. So here you have, on behalf of the state, the confusion mongers who come in and advise the people what to do with their hearts and what to do with their minds in such a situation, right? And their advice is to forgive the police, even when they're not held accountable, even when no form of accountability is taking place, even when they don't even acknowledge they did something wrong, we're to forgive them. Okay, that's on the one hand. Then on the other hand, the NBA, this is the same NBA who the protesters targeted. This isn't another NBA. This isn't a separate, non-biased, objective NBA. This is the same NBA who just took a major loss when the protesters seized their stadium. They are now so interested in justice that they're going to provide a platform for a peaceful march. And what that ultimately means is we're going to pay you to spin you off in another direction where your energy your energy and passion and drive will go into a quagmire, or will go into a dead end where it'll just fizzle away and die down. And that's exactly what happened, right? That's exactly what happened. And anyone with any understanding of history, who studied history even a little bit, could clearly recognize that this is the tried and true strategy that they use again and again to deal with our protests and uprisings, right? This was an intelligent design, what I'm trying to say. This wasn't a spontaneous, people being moved by their hearts. This was an intelligent design. It was a 1-2 punch against the uprising of oppressed people. And these people came in, spoke at the eulogy, and left. They had no meetings with the community. They had no meetings with protesters. They had no advice for ongoing organizing. They merely came in to placate the people and left. And you don't find them talking about Stephon Clark. You don't find them bringing attention to that issue. So, and I wanted to really drive that point, because we have to understand that when we look at the left and the right, you're looking at the left wing and the right wing of a drone, of a machine which bombs children. And they're lending themselves to it. They're lending themselves to it and trying to appropriate Islam, trying to appropriate our hearts, our emotions, our empathy. They're trying to appropriate that for the sake of these people who are killing innocent people, and people who are protecting the killers, and people who are providing resources and stability for these killers. And they're lending themselves to that.
Thank you, Hannibal. Very clear, very concrete, not abstract. Thank you very much. I think Tanzeen can start.
Inshallah. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu'alaikum to all the believers who are listening. who are going to be watching this at some point, inshallah, and those of you who are present. I would just like to first initially thank Dar Al Janub as an organization and for this important opportunity for this joint event, and very excited and honored to be invited by an organization that we found out from good information that Marcus gave us that for your pro-Palestinian position and the critique of Zionist occupation of our third holiest site in Islam, which is Masjid al-Aqsa. We're really excited about these kinds of interactions because we want to bypass the other kind of unity that both my brother Hannibal and my sister Isra had explained, which is the unity of those who are hypocrites and those who are disbelievers who are working against the Islamic struggle. So we would like to have a different kind of unity with those organizations and those movements without organizations who are not necessarily visible to the public eye, who are challenging Western secular power, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Somalia, Sudan, northern Nigeria, parts of Central Asia, like Afghanistan, whether it's East or West Pakistan. Those are the struggles that carry the tradition of Malcolm X. People always often think about Malcolm X as only internal to the United States, but Malcolm X comes from a larger tradition that a huge majority of what used to be in the United States, unfortunately, a lot of it has been successfully dismantled by the white power structure, and majority of that tradition now happens to be elsewhere. Those of us who are inside America, we have an obligation to not just the tradition of Malcolm X, but the tradition of Islamic struggle that were initiated by brothers like Hassan al-Banna, sisters like Zainab al-Ghazali, martyrs like Sayyid Qutb, Abdullah Azim, and others. And this is the kind of global struggle that us as a project, us as a small voice of that tradition, that we want to instill in the West, because that's where we're located, that we expect and we hope that some of the brothers and sisters here are going to begin a different kind of conversation outside of the political spectrum of secularism. Secularism is a disease and a system and a structure, an ontological configuration that not only poisons Western Muslims, it is also there in post-colonial Muslim states who have experienced secular decolonization, which didn't give them much. What we want for the Muslim populations everywhere is honor and dignity back. That is much more important than anything else, so that they can pray and worship only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and nothing else. In our piece, which was in 2019, we did begin by talking about two figures in the West, Hamza Yusuf and Omar Suleiman. There are many others like that. They were simply examples. But we want to also emphasize that they have no influence whatsoever on the Islamic struggle. The Islamic struggle is much larger. We have great scholars. We have those who are willing to give their lives as we speak, and those who struggle and they know that their destination is prison, their destination is torture cells, their destination is black sites, but they're focused on the akhirah. There's two types of people, those who are interested in the dunya and those who are interested in the akhirah. So we want to focus on that, and this is exactly why we want new conversations, new forms of dynamic struggles that can bypass all of that conversation. Sometimes we ourselves engage in these Western conversations because we have to, we find ourselves in those debates. But a larger part of our emphasis is actually on those traditions that are much larger and much bigger. And we want to make sure that the three categories of people that are going to be the first to enter the hellfire, that we are very distant from them. Number one are the misleading scholars. They're going to be the first ones into the hellfire. Number two are the false martyrs, people who died thinking of their big names, that they're going to be recognized as their names, not for this pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are the false martyrs. There are movements like this that seduce martyrs, and this is very problematic, and we have to critique them. Number three are those who are false humanitarians who do charity, and this is the kind of charity that is not for the sake of pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we want to make sure that we're none of those categories. We don't have false scholarship, we don't have false martyrdom, we don't have false charity workers. And so in order to have that, we have to follow the Quran and the Sunnah and the Aqidah of the Salafiyah, and that has to be the perspective. We do want to collaborate with non-Muslims who fit a criteria that is given in the Quran. Number one are those non-Muslims who struggle without knowing that what they're doing is benefiting Islam. We have to find out who these people are. That's our obligation. Number two, there are those non-Muslims who live a life in which they're not harming Muslims and they're not necessarily harming the system of oppression. They're simply neutral. It's our job to invite them to Islam. It's our job to inform them and educate them. We have an educational plan for them. Number three is the type of non-Muslims who are the enemies of Islam, and we know it clearly through our analysis and through simply looking at their actions and their speech. These are the enemies of Islam that require full and absolute retaliation from Muslims. So any kind of scholars, any kind of people who join, now we're getting to the topic of the article, who join the political spectrum by being part of the liberal left and by claiming social justice. But in the end, their work supports the structure of secular capitalism in the name of secular decolonization. So not only are they part of the problem, the part of secular capitalism, they're also part of the problem in terms of the solution that they propose. Their solution ultimately rests with how much of recognition and acceptance they're going to get in Western and secular left wing, the left part of the movement. So what they say, their tongue, we don't know what's in their heart. We're going to judge them by their actions. What they do and what they say with their tongue, if it supports, if it's statements like, the police are here because they want to support the protesters and there are policemen with good hearts. That was the comment that they made. That's a very problematic statement. That's a statement that is complicit with the American desiring machine. The American desiring machine desires the lives of people who were enslaved, of people who were genocided on land, and people who are considered the enemy combatant of secularism. So these are the three categories that America is based on. America is constructed on two figures, on identifying who the enemy combatant is, who the terrorist figure is. This was, and all you German speakers would know, the Musliman. The figure of the Musliman was based on this idea of the enemy combatant, of those who are going to be considered the complete radical other to what America and Europe is going to be about, and ultimately secularity. The other figure is the figure of the modern victims of slavery. And so there is a way to understand structurally why the American project and the European project is based on the evacuation of those other histories. And so in our paper, we wanted to focus on that kind of analysis. The other thing that I would like to then quickly say, things that are really just derivations of what Hannibal and Isra had mentioned earlier, which is that there are really four types of even Muslims that we had critiqued towards the end of the piece. We talked about those who are white passing Muslims. We don't mean it in ethnic terms. There are Muslims who basically pass to have a civil society life, which is very comfortable and fits nicely with secular capitalism. Number two are assimilated immigrants, the mudajjin, who are people who like to live, for whatever reason, worldly pursuits as assimilated immigrants in Western societies without raising their voice for their brothers and sisters in other lands, in other areas. The third are Black Muslims who are leaving the Malcolm X tradition, are joining to become patriots. So these are deeply problematic figures because they have the kind of pigmentation that can confuse people that they're part of the struggle. We are very clear in Milestones that we don't believe in the false binary of immigrant versus Black, because this is often used, sometimes even with good intentions, to promote that, hey, listen, the immigrants are just assimilated and all the Black leadership are going to be fighting against white supremacy. We know that in the last 20 years or so of the war on terror, that the RAND project and other privatized sectors worked with the state to create the kinds of Black Muslims who give comments and condemnation of immigrants in other areas, in places like Afghanistan, in places like Palestine, in places like Syria, places like Iraq, where they're fighting back, they're condemning those brothers and sisters. We cannot condemn them by using race as some kind of advantage that they automatically have biologically. We don't believe in that. We believe that this is a false binary. We think there are immigrants who fight back. We think there's Black people who fight back. We think there's immigrants who are sellouts. We think there's Black people who are sellouts. We have no problem mentioning this very clearly and openly. We fear no one to say that because we're only worried about pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we want to work to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's our aim, not to please any kind of social movement whatsoever that is secular. Number four are what I would consider a new kind of gender war, which is orchestrated from the outside, which the Muslim community is now participating in. There are brothers who use a cultural argument of patriarchy, and there are sisters who are using feminism to engage in gender war, which is a distraction for the Islamic struggle. We believe that the Sharia provides us very clear articulation of the roles and of our genders, very clear articulation of how we have to understand ourselves in terms of our natures. We don't question that, and we classical scholarship and the scholarship of those who were near and dear to the Prophet ﷺ. We are nobody compared to them. So this is how I would end my part of the presentation. I wanted to add a couple of things just to make sure that we have this framework of Islam in mind, inshallah. So I want to thank everyone who listened, inshallah. Assalamu'alaikum.
Thank you, Tanzim. And of course, thank you, Isra, and thank you, Hannibal, for this comprehensive and different analysis where you live and in which struggles are you part of. It's not easy to have the right questions. It's so much impact what you said that I think in Dar Al Janub and around Dar Al Janub, we need time to work with this, but it's good. It's good because it's not easy. All your references on concrete situations and make your views very understandable. Now we could begin with questions to you from the participants. And maybe I will begin with a question from Dar Al Janub about leadership. The modern version of society means extreme individualism society and community is nothing, and the person and the identity and the individual is everything. And this is, and not only some special segments of society are infected with this. All people from different colors, different backgrounds are infected with this ideology. So the contrast, the opposite of this individualism is, in our belief, is the thinking of leadership, collective leadership, and leadership from a collective, leadership from a community. Also against what you said, against misleadership. We understand your essay as a critique to misleadership, and also a call out for leadership. We have to find leaders in our communities, in our spaces, from our own, not from the empire, not from the state, not from the institutions, not from Ford Foundation or the money from Ford Foundation. They cannot give us any help or any leadership or thinking about leadership. So the question is to you, how can we begin a discussion in our communities, attacked, fragmented, targeted communities about leadership? And how should leadership legitimize themselves? Yes, maybe you have an answer. Free, it's up to you. Thank you. Maybe Isra, you want to begin?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that question. And I think it's something I've also been dealing and considering with, about the question of leadership and how to legitimize.
Isra, sorry, can you go nearer to the microphone?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, better.
I don't know.
Or turn.
Maybe,
You guys want to go?
maybe, I don't know if you can bring it closer, maybe, I don't know. Because it's kind of low.
Mike. Yeah.
You guys want to go first until I fix it then?
Okay,
You-
inshallah. Well, I would say, you know, in thinking about leadership, we have to think about not what our vision of ideal leadership is, but of, you know, the people who have the capacity to lead, people who have the capacity to organize and influence their communities, and ultimately, you know, part of the problem that we're faced with today is that people have made leadership into this thing that's sort of like such a high pedestal that is, you know, reserved only for these like super elite. And you know, by the very nature of that approach, it leaves it for you know, people who would manipulate that. You know, it leaves it for people who are not really are not the kind of grassroots oriented kind of people that are needed. You know, they're not the kind of people who are among their community, who are living alongside the people that they're trying to lead, etc. And so it kind of like makes it so the leaders have to be this sort of celebrity person who lives somewhere far, so that you can't see them up close to be a real person. Because if you see any of their flaws, then it's like, okay, well, this person has flaws. They can't be a leader. They can't organize anymore because they have things I don't like about them, kind of thing. You know, there is a financial driving force behind, who's appointed to these like celebrity leadership positions, these sort of like symbolic public figures, and I relate them kind of like they're kind of like Gandhi figures. They're like these people who come around and they're not personally responsible for any the particular community or personally responsible for the particular issues that they speak on. They don't put a stake in being accountable to the community on those issues. They sort of travel around getting paid a lot of money for these speaking engagements, and so we have to really reverse that approach, and we have to start thinking about the kind of individuals that can not merely look perfect on TV, on YouTube, or what have you, but the kind of people that can go into their community like a physician and really assess the illnesses, assess the social, physical, economic illnesses that are plaguing people and that are keeping people from their fitra. That there's something keeping us from what Allah has created us for. There's something keeping us from that, and it's these illnesses. There's social illnesses, there's physical illnesses, there's economic exploitation, what people are suffering under. And so the leaders really need to be people who can go into the community and assess the ailments of the people and apply themselves to it and be responsible for the follow through of addressing those ailments. You know what I mean? Because that's, I think, one of the biggest problems that we see is that even you have some people who might give mention to some of the issues, but you don't see this sort of people committing themselves and applying themselves to a particular community. And even more importantly, we got to look at areas. We have to look at geographic areas. You know what I mean? We got to get away from this sort of modern abstract idea of community where, I get to just pick, 17 individuals across the world and say, well, these 7 individuals are my community, even though we're all in different countries and we never see each other, what have you. We have to reorient ourselves towards the geographic spaces that people have to live in. We have to orient ourselves towards the homeless camps. At least in America, there's homeless camps popping up everywhere. So we have to orient ourselves to that. That homeless camp doesn't have a presence on Facebook. It doesn't have a presence on Twitter. You have to go there and orient yourselves to the illnesses and needs of people, right? There's certain neighborhoods, etc. And so we have to orient ourselves to geographic spaces that people have to live in, because if we can create a certain environment in a geographical space, we can invite others into it. We can expand it. We can grow it. And that's where, we can create a conducive environment for our children, and I think that's very, very important, because when we talk about making change, we really should be thinking about creating the environment for change makers to come forth, creating the environment for the children to come up with the kind of discipline and the kind of constitution and the kind of, an internal fortitude and clarity and wisdom that is going to be required to make change. And I think that comes down to, creating an environment, creating a climate in your neighborhood, and creating, a space that where people can actually live and live in a practical way. We think about Islam. What's the difference between Islam and other religions? This is a deen. This is a way of life that deals with every aspect of our life. And so it's not enough to just talk about beliefs, but we have to be applying ourselves to the daily lives of people, and I think, that's how real leadership legitimizes itself, is by first and foremost applying itself to the needs and the illnesses and the ailments of their community. And I think that very same mechanism is the protection against misleadership, because when you empower the people, you improve their condition, you know, physically, spiritually, emotionally, economically, etc., you're like inoculating them from ignorance, you're inoculating them from oppression, you're strengthening them so that they can resist that kind of oppression, along with that misleadership that goes along with it, you know. And so I think it really comes down to investing in spaces that people have to live in, creating a climate where, you know, we can implement Islam, we can create an Islamic environment, you know. And if we're not doing that, if we're merely talking about beliefs, then our dawah is going to be empty. Our dawah is going to be you know, it's going to be bankrupt, because you have to create a space where people can see a different way of life, you know what I mean? And I think the oppressed people here, I think the community I grew up in would be like rushing to Islam if they were able to see spaces and environments where people are dedicated to justice, where people are dedicated to the spiritual, mental, emotional health of everyone in the environment, you know. And I think that's only possible through Islam. That's only possible through that kind of focus, you know.
Yeah, I wanted to continue from that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannibal, for that. I really like that answer about legitimizing leadership, about long-term commitment to a certain geographic space or a community. I don't have an answer of how we legitimize leadership, but I wanted to give a personal, concrete example of how just individualistic the social activism really is in the U.S. So the mainstream activism in the U.S. is really committed to creating this celebrity activist class. So we have very big activists and organizers that I think are like, you know, they have become kind of like these cultural icons, just like athletes and singers, and they have like their own branding and marketing and like their own business. So just for me, because growing up in South Florida, and my point of entry in a lot of activism was, you know, around 15, 16, being continuously like radicalized, being pulled into nonprofit work, and then back and forth in that process, because of, you know, my identity of being like visibly Muslim, being visibly Black and a woman. Within the nonprofit space, a lot of organizers and leaders would look at me and see me, oh, this girl knows how to articulate herself well. She's concerned about social justice issues. Let's start calling her a leader. And I was only like, you know, 16, 17, being called a leader by, you know, these larger celebrity activists, organizers and whatnot. And that kind of, that really, I think it really stopped from like my involvement in my activism and education. My political education itself became really fragmented because I was started being called leader at a very young age, just because I knew how to speak well and that I was concerned about different like social justice issues and whatnot. And slowly but surely I can kind of like look back at that example and that personal experience and see how just me being, you know, the way that I am and how I'm being presented, of how I was utilized by nonprofits within that space, within movements, by organizers, older people, to basically market myself and call myself a leader, to be like a future celebrity activist. And I think that's a very honest observation we really have to make, because this is very common. It's very common within the US. I don't know about elsewhere, but just like mainstream activism in the US, where you have a lot of older celebrity activists who basically take like young people and start calling them leaders, and then these young people are confused about what their political ideology is even. I didn't even know what my political ideology was. I didn't know what my orientation was. I only knew like terms here and there, and I was good with social media and whatnot. But they took that to take advantage, to kind of manipulate and call, oh, you know, I'm the mentor for this girl and look how she's become. So I think this is really, really important to point out, because a lot of young people become radicalized, and their radicalism becomes exhausted within this nonprofit industrial complex machine, and by these organizers who continually do this and whatnot. So, I mean, because I know young people who were with me around the same age who I see now, and I understand where they're at, because, you know, fortunately for me, I was able to come to this place with milestones, but for so many others, they don't have the space. They don't see the interventions. They're not given the correct interventions to step away from that type of really, you know, manipulative and kind of like very toxic environment. So just very important to, just wanted to share and point that out.
So you had the power to escape then?
I would, yeah, I would say it was just, luckily I was isolated in different ways. So I think it worked to my advantage. But yeah, unfortunately, just a lot of younger people just aren't able to meet that intervention or have that intervention.
Thank you. Tanzeen, do you have a comment on leadership?
Maybe a little bit, not much. You know, I think one of the best ways to understand leadership, I don't use that word as much, but I think it's to see how they deal with their situation, their environment in a battle. So one of the best ways that what we can figure out who's whom is under a stress and pressured situation. How do they respond? That's where speech doesn't help you. That's where you have to do certain things beyond just your basic position or perspective. So I think that's, you know, one of the ways. I can't mention certain names, but, you know, for example, in Afghanistan, in the struggle against the Soviets, when they wanted to take over, the Mujahideen started to respect some of the fighters who came there as travelers to help the Mujahideen. And the way the Mujahideen judged them and assessed who's whom and accepted the leadership of so-called foreigners, or Arabs in this case, was by looking at how they performed in specific battles. And they performed really well, and that's how the leadership was accepted. The same thing happened in various parts of the Islamic world, whether it's Gaza in Palestine, whether it's the rebellions that's happening in Syria and other places like Iraq. And so the best way to see who's whom is to look at how they engage with the community and how much they're oriented towards the Islamic tradition, and actually they're willing to be responsible with the deen. So, and they're, you know, at the level of that battle we're talking about is like performance, both as ideologues and militarily and so on. So it's really dependent on that. So the other thing I would say is Malcolm X, because we're talking about Malcolm X here partially, is that he wanted to bypass the civil rights leadership of his day and focus on local leaders. What he meant by is that how is different parts of the hood being organized by specific people who want to blockade the white supremacist economy and who want to challenge it so it can't function anymore. So those are the kinds of leaderships at different parts where we won't even hear names. So I always go for people who are not necessarily big names in particular, you know, states or whatever, and try to go to the streets and see the protest structure. Who's actually doing the freeway shutdowns? Who's actually, you know, responsible in mobilizing people? And also, you know, in the Islamic tradition, normally leaders don't want credit. You know, so that's a good test to see that they're not calling themselves anything. They're not calling themselves, I'm the clergy of the street. they don't say stuff like that. They don't say I'm the sacred activist, you know. And they just simply do certain things and you respect them. You know, and I want to say that, and I want to put the brother on the spot, but there's someone like Amir Abdul Malik Ali has been the Amir of the struggle for over 20, 30 years now. Partly because he doesn't call himself a leader constantly. He doesn't, and it's just simply he did certain things that help us to respect him much more than many well-known people nowadays that we see on TV who are calling themselves the clergy of the street. And so, inshallah, that's how we look at things, and I think that's how we should. I mean, that's the best I can think of is how are leaders trying to emulate the tradition of the prophets, peace be upon them. That's basically how I look at leadership.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The chat is open, so people, the four participants or the participants online can ask questions in the chat. And in between, Iman will have, from our visitors here, Iman has a question to you all.
Okay, can you hear me well, or yeah? Okay.
Yes.
So because the topic of feminism came up and like the so-called gender war, I was wondering, like, I understand the critique of feminism and it does not resonate with, I believe, most Muslim women, because it has been co-opted by liberalism and because, especially white liberalism, and by those who want to uphold the empire and like Western hegemony globally. But there still are problems within like the Muslim community and globally, of course, concerning women's rights. And Islam does grant us rights, of course, but the problem is the patriarchal interpretation of a lot of what Islam presents as, gender roles, for example, and generally just, colonial values being imposed on Muslim countries. So what exactly was your critique and like how should we go on about it? Because that wasn't very clear to me. Just what do we do as Muslim women and as the Muslim community concerning women's rights? Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
Rosine, how about you go first? And then I'll add. So
You
you can get anthropology.
So I actually was responsible for bringing the gender war up. So I will say a couple of things. I mean, there is a paper that I wrote, which I could also send to the participants.
Yes, please.
So one of the things that I would immediately kind of acknowledge is that much of what secular capitalism has done is also actually responsible in creating certain kinds of gender-related questions of how labor is divided, how the household is divided, and how it's structured in an economic way. So that created a very particular kind of co-optation of Protestant values into capitalism. So this created a very specific kind of tension in relations of gender. What I was critiquing, though, is the solution to that problem is when the people who are fighting against various forms of structure of oppression, they most immediately go to feminism as a discourse instead of Islam as a discourse to find solutions that are available. So those of us, and historically, it's not just about us, the Islamic struggle have always suggested, not only just in the case of gender, in the case of everything else, that Islam is very confident in providing solutions. I'm getting echo here, so it's probably the volume. But Islam is very confident as a discourse in providing solutions for all of the problems, including questions.
Maybe, Marcus, if you want to just turn your microphone off for a second.
Yes.
Sure.
Let me check. It's working. Okay. So one of the things that I want to emphasize is that sisters in the struggle and Muslims in general should refer to the Quran and the Sunnah and the Sharia and the entire classical corpus, which is a very robust corpus, to refer to that to find solutions for any kind of harm that happens to them instead of immediately going towards the feminist literature. And and I think that is really important. So when the immediate response is to go to the left to find feminist solutions, then we see a huge development of a kind of ignorance about Islam and kind of arrogance towards the Islamic corpus without sometimes unknowingly and sometimes thinking that this is done to support, to give rights and so on to women by bypassing the Islamic corpus. I'm very worried and concerned about that at the level of our belief system and also as a practical solution for Muslim societies that they're constantly finding themselves to be. The other thing that I wanted to really share with the sister who asked the question is that I also mentioned, when I mentioned gender war, men, that men who immediately use cultural arguments in the name of Islam to support their positions is also, I believe, is incorrect because it's kind of received wisdom without a proper assessment of every situation through the Islamic discourse. So we want everyone to participate in the Islamic discourse and to find solutions and have the iman, the faith that this allows a solution for the family and for the Muslim man and for the Muslim woman and for children, etc. So that would be my response. The other thing is that feminism has a huge structural connection with the emergence of European, many thinkers in the European tradition have called the radical autonomous subject. The radical autonomous subject, the subject of enlightenment, is precisely constructed against the Muslim, against the Islamic subject who is obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to divine power. Said Qutb had talked about divine power, divine will, and divine law. The radical autonomous subject of Europe is the opposite of the Muslim obedient subject who's obedient to divine power, divine will, and divine law. So I worry that someone who bypasses Islamic discourse to go to any other discourse, feminism, communism, socialism, whatever, anarchism, all of those things, nationalism, all of those things are not necessarily and often are not beginning with that obedience to divine law, divine power, and divine will. And so this is how I have a worry for other discourses, if that makes sense. And this other discourses includes feminism, but is not only exclusive to feminism, it's many other things. So that's why I even brought up decolonization having this problem. I brought up, now I mentioned socialism and other things, which could have this problem as well. That our orientation as Muslim, how do we orient ourselves, is by being obedient to divine will. And so, inshallah, I hope that I answered the question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sanjeen, for that. I also wanted to add, because this question, I can also relate to it personally, is that I think just being like a Muslim woman, growing up as a Muslim woman in the West, because a Muslim woman is one of colonialism's like favorite debate topics, we don't see enough intellectually rigorous interventions from like the Islamic discourse. And so our first response is to go to feminism. And I think for me, and just in my evolution, just like how we kind of stated in the article, before, when I used to think of like political solutions and political problems, I would frame it as a problem between the left and the right. And so also for like Muslim women issues, I would frame it as like, oh, feminism or, cultural patriarchy, just in that kind of frame. But for me, I had to kind of understand that that frame is limiting and it goes beyond that. It's the problems and solutions for Muslim women goes beyond the discourse and history of like feminism and discourses about patriarchy coming from like, a white history, essentially. So I think for me, that was really the beginning of actually taking a step back and looking at it objectively, because like you are right, there are very serious issues we have like within the Muslim community, and especially, for like Muslim men, utilizing a discourse of like patriarchy, like white patriarchy, actually, and these like, and discourse from like the white right, to push that. But it's also kind of a responsibility for us to also look back and see how feminism plays a structural role within, secular colonialism, and how we can go beyond that. Just like we want to go beyond the spectrum of like a left and right political spectrum, we understand that we can go beyond that, to locate, the solutions to our problems, and that location can be Islam. I think it's just that it's so frustrating for us because we often don't see very intellectually rigorous interventions from like the Islamic corpus coming to us. But they do exist, and it's just for us to go find it, research it, and talk about it as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would like to chime in just briefly, because one thing they didn't mention, just with the specific history of the term, and when you look at how the term feminism comes about, it was a movement of white women who were fighting against the enfranchisement of Black people in general, but more specifically Black men. And their initial formation was a group of white women who were campaigning to prevent Black men from having a right to vote. And their argument was that white women are a much better pillar of patriarchy, and actually patriarchy. They call themselves better patriarchs because they have the ability to give birth to white men, etc. And that, their argument is that they're much more loyal and capable colonizers, and therefore they're more deserving, and they're more deserving of the right to vote within the society. And so their initial formation wasn't merely an independent, women against men fight. Their initial impetus was a reaction to Black people giving the right to vote. And so it was an initial white supremacist movement. It was an initial reaction on the part of white women who believed, this was their opportunity to, take their role on the public stage by suppressing specifically Black men. And that's the genesis of the word, right? And so when we think about using a word to capture our cosmology, or using a word to identify ourselves as an identity, is very, very important, the root of the word, because essentially one is saying that this is the kind of reasoning and discourse that I find to be most true, or most effective, or most reflective of myself. And I find that a lot of modern feminists divorce themselves completely from that history. And, understandably, but they still don't divorce themselves from the word, which is an interesting thing, because one would think that given the history and, how it came about, that people wouldn't be committed to carrying it forward, that they would be committed to, they would find another way to identify their particular struggle, because I don't think that any of today's modern feminists, even the most vulgar white feminists, would say that they're fighting against the right of Black people to be included in the democracy. And that was, that was the birth of their movement. So So it's important. That's an important history, and I think that it's worthwhile to explore the work of people like Dr. Tommy Curry, who he has a particular book called The Man Not, where he talks about Black masculinity, and he talks about the history of feminism, its initial formation, and how these dominant components of it were functioning as a mechanism of anti-Blackness. And for various reasons, which I think he delves into way deeper than I could, and he articulates way better than I could. There's been certain political agendas within there that have been consistently consistent with their initial formation of what the initial purpose was. And so, and then going back to what Tanzine said, there's so many different types of isms. There's so many different types of isms. Like if you go back a few years, you would find me writing about anarchism, because I felt that anarchism at the time, I felt it reflected my interest the most. Or other things at other times, and or at one point you might find me dealing with Black nationalism. But so long as I'm committed to an unflinching analysis, a whole analysis of the idea, and I'm not coveting and harboring my own personal affinities for whatever privileges or pleasures that I get from being a Black nationalist or being an anarchist or what have you, as long as I'm willing to consider them in a critical way on whole, then I find them to be to fall very short of what I actually believe I am, and I find them to fall very short of what I actually want to do. And then learning more about Islam and digging deeper into the Islamic corpus, you find that I find personally, I can speak for myself, I find personally that all of the issues that I was very interested in, why I identified as an anarchist at one point, why I identified as a nationalist at one point, etc., all of those issues are dealt with in the Islamic corpus. And ultimately, within those limiting avenues, you find a dead end, but there's no dead end in Islam. And when you start digging into the Islamic corpus, you find that it opens up more possibilities for you. It opens up more avenues of approaching different problems. And it's liberating. I mean, a lot of people think it's something that's confining, but when you really dig into the ideas, you dig into the debates that different scholars have had, you dig into the historical approaches that different specific communities took in different time periods, and the very rich history of Islamic struggle. And you will find that each issue that you might be concerned about is dealt with in there somewhere in a meaningful way.
Thank you. Thank you all. Is there some questions in the chat? No. Questions from the audience? Okay, so please. Another question?
I have a question because we already spoke about who are false leaders in the communities. We spoke about how to identify false leaders in the community. And I wanted to ask what to do about false leaders in the community, how to confront them, or is it even smart to confront false leaders in the community? Because after all, they are leaders, and most of the time people ask you, what are your credentials to confront this or bring it up? And also it's some kind of infighting, I feel like I think Malcolm X also talked about it in his message to the grassroots. You don't I think he called it something like dirty laundry or something. You don't do it in the public, and that's why I wanted to ask what to do about false leaders.
Oh, I'd like to respond to that. Because that's a really important point about the dirty laundry, right? And I think that sometimes, a lot of times, actually, it gets used against intellectual rigor, right? So in order for us to have an intellectually rigorous engagement, for us to really like struggle through our ideas, we have to be able to challenge each other. We have to challenge friend or foe. We have to challenge the ideas, and we have to work through the ideas in a rigorous way and not in a lazy way. Even if we don't like them, we still have to struggle through them diligently to articulate what exactly is wrong with them, and you know, to protect ourselves and our community from falling into thoughtless patterns of dismissing people. Well, you know, my sheikh disagrees with him, so I don't need to think about anything he says, you know, or so and so said he's an Uncle Tom, so I don't even need to consider anything he says. But we have to be rigorous, even when we're thinking about the words of someone that we don't even respect. We still have to be rigorous in thinking about the ideas. Are they right? Is any part of it right? What exactly is wrong, etc. And so anyone, and we have to be respectful and sincere, right? And I think that is what makes it not like just a fitna and not just like infighting or dirty laundry, is the sincerity and the respectful approach, and the intention. You know, some people will take details and put them out there for the sake of the shock value and the rhetoric, and then try to make use of that, you know, and make use of the conflict, you know. But we have to challenge ideas in the most respectful way possible, so that we can have a sincere engagement, so that, you know, like false leaders need to be questioned. They need to be questioned, but not like an interrogation. They need to be questioned so they can provide clarity on their false position, right? Because what makes them a false leader is that they're taking a problematic or unjust position on something, right? And ultimately, the real way to get at them is question them. Well, why do you do this? What's your justification? What's your reasoning to arrive at that conclusion? And this kind of thing. And a lot of times, by making them work through the ideas, you'll find everyone starts to realize it doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? And so, you know, but you can't get that kind of engagement if it's just perceived as hostility or disrespect or slander, that kind of thing. So there's a delicate, you know, way of dealing with that. But you know, they have to be questioned, and you know, that them not wanting to answer is like a first indication that they're a false leader, because you're asking them sincere, legitimate questions and they don't want to engage. You know, and this is something that we saw on the part of certain people. You know, like even our article, when we were initially writing it, and you know, some people knew that we were writing it, and you know, we were told, well, we'll engage with your ideas as long as you don't publish anything, and then if you decide to publish it, then we're not going to engage you at all. And I find that to be a trait of hypocrites. I find that to be a very hypocritical trait, you know, that you'll discuss privately issues that affect everyone, but you're not willing to publicly engage those ideas in front of the community. You're not willing to be open to engagement by anyone. A real leader is not going to pick and choose who has enough status and value as a person to engage their ideas. A real leader is concerned about everyone in their community. So if you have a concern, they're going to be obliged to address it. If they really value, the position they're in, if they really respect the role that they're playing as a leader, they will want to be accountable to you, not just look a certain way in public, but they would want to be accountable to you and to your questions, especially if you can give it to them in a respectful way, and it's difficult because people who would take that approach of being direct sometimes are blamed as like they're starting conflicts. You know what I mean? And I find that, even with respect to issues that women are dealing with, you find that a lot of times women's questions are just brushed off. You know what I mean? And I think that's a big reason why you find so many people looking for other ways, other approaches, because leaders are so comfortable to just dismiss questions. I'm not going to deal with that, or I'm going to deal with that, but I'm not going to go deep into that. And you find the same thing with issues of racism, issues of economic exploitation, issues of politics and foreign policy, the wars that are happening in the Muslim world. What are these leaders' positions on their nation's role in the destruction of Muslim societies? What's their position? How do they deal with it? How do they engage in it, with those ideas, etc.? A lot of times it comes down to clarity, and you'll find that the misleaders protect themselves even from being questioned. They protect themselves from question and answer sections. They protect themselves from being accessible to the community, which is a responsibility of all leaders. They protect themselves from their positions and their actions coming under question. They protect themselves from their involvement in certain entities and their involvement in certain agendas. They protect themselves from all these different forms of accountability that any leader should be held to. So that there's this thing that you can find with a lot of them. Is a great indicator is that they're protecting themselves from being questioned, from being clear, from being challenged, etc. And I think that's ultimately the real medicine for people like that. It's not to like battle them and try to isolate them, but as best you can to try to pull them into a sincere public engagement on the issues at hand. What's the problem with their position? What's the problem with something they said? And as best you can to draw them into an engagement where they can explain it or they can defend it for the whole community. And then and once the broader community is aware of the contradictions and hypocrisies, their power begins to shrivel up. Their power to mislead begins to shrivel up. People start to become aware, like, oh, here comes, that guy with the funny zigzag position, here goes the crooked stepper, the two stepper, you know what I mean, who dances around the issues. People will know. And I think especially for like the brother was saying, like they deal with you as if you're not even qualified to question them. When you're dealing with people like that, it can be very challenging because they use all the resources at their disposal to try to isolate and marginalize people they consider to be individual threats. And so I think the best bet is trying to find a way to engage their ideas publicly, find a way to clarify exactly what the issues are.
Yeah. And just to kind of reiterate on Hannibal's point, I think the purpose of ethically and respectfully confronting a public leader is that we're not aiming to convert this leader. And that wasn't the purpose of our article. the purpose of our article was to speak publicly about these two different types of leaders, the two types. So once we do that kind of public ethical intervention, the community, the social basis of those leaders can then make their own decisions on how they would like to proceed. So I think just another example with us too, with this specific article, once we published it, we did have some backlash from some of the leaders and people close to them and organizations close to them. However, we also had young Muslims, reach out to us personally, reach out to me personally, and talk about how they've been having similar thoughts, how they've been wanting a space to talk about these issues and questions. And we've actually started a lot of private debates within, a lot of WhatsApp chats and Facebook, forums that we don't get to see, that's not being publicized, but they do happen because we we make that public intervention. And so whether the false leader or, people close to them want to question your credentials, as long as you still take the step to ask a principled question and they don't respond, what their position is going to basically tell their social base where they stand, and then the people within that social base are going to make their own decisions. They're gonna start thinking for themselves. They're gonna start, organizing and talking among themselves and say like, well, hold up, I actually agree with this person, and let me actually divorce myself from this organization or group. And it's happening and it keeps on occurring. But it's important that you keep that in mind, because not everything has to be publicized or made public just because you don't see it, but you initiate those little debates, so.
Tanzeen, any comment?
Very briefly. I'm echoing again. Okay. I would just add that the Hadith tells us that the tradition is that when you see injustice, change it with your hands. If you cannot do that, speak out against it. And if you cannot do that, you hate the injustice in your heart. False leaders do it backwards. So they see an injustice and they first hate it in their heart. And they say, you should hate it in your heart. At best, if they're pressured, if there is a historical social situation emerging, they start speaking out against it. But when they're really checked, when the enemy comes and checks them, then they get quiet, or they say, oh, there are some good cops out there. And then, of course, they would never do much with their hands. And so, it's fairly easy to understand those who immediately respond with their hands when they see injustice. And they have the faith to do that. And that kind of attitude is what separates a Muslim who wants to struggle and someone who doesn't have faith. They would always question that, well, you don't have all these, great technology and weapons to fight against such a huge monster who has all these weapons of the world. A Muslim, the way we are different is that we don't calculate everything on military terms. We also have our heart, which is so prepared that it is actually extremely dangerous to fight a real Muslim. And so, when the Russians were fighting the Chechens, one of the Russian generals had said that you can never win against a population who see their freedom in the barrel of my gun. So that's basically leadership, is when you actually follow the Hadith correctly in its proper hierarchy. On one hand, you do need to have a very strong foundation, so your heart's prepared. You constantly do tazkiyah and you engage, you make your soul powerful. But when you see injustice, so I always look out for young brothers and sisters, not just impulsive people, not just people who make a lot of noise, but when they see injustice, they make moves with their hands as quickly as they can. And that kind of orientation is really helpful for the Islamic struggle. And we need to be vigilant in finding those kinds of young people and older people. And I'm not always just young and old, but I just think that people who are oriented in that kind of prophetic way is really what the focus should be. I mean, the false leaders should be, by maintaining Islamic manners, should be critiqued, condemned, unfollowed, etc. But really, they should not be the focus. The focus should be there are actually very good leaders throughout the Islamic world, unknown and known, that we can follow and who are doing a great job. And we sometimes don't give ourselves enough credit. We have to understand that America lost the war in Afghanistan. It's not in their control. America lost the war in Iraq. It's not in their control. Israelis are constantly living in fear. What if some kid from Gaza does something to us while we're having coffee in this nice cafe? They don't know what's going to happen. Why? Because there's always going to be this young brother who might just take that hadith very seriously. And we believe that to be the case. And every time they get comfortable, something happens to them. So we have to believe in the qadr of Allah, that Allah has written victory for those who are patient and those who fight with honor. And so this is really the orientation that I think we should have. We should stop depending on the celebrity. We didn't write this because we think these figures and like them are going to have some huge influence. They don't have any influence. They don't have real influence for people who really want to struggle. They just have influence over the weak. And so it's really a choice for Muslims if they want to continue to be weak or if they want to actually struggle. So, those of us who are slightly in touch with the Muslim world, it's not that we're not trying to be proud. It's just simply that we have we can clearly see a few things. That's all. And it's our obligation to share knowledge. When we have some information, we're actually obligated to share that information with other Muslims. So that's the only thing that we wanted to do. And I think, Malcolm X was one of those clear-headed, clearly understood these basic factors. And he understood how the civil rights leaders were kind of the leaders of the weak. They were the ones who created excuses for those who were weak. So Malcolm was very much in touch with very strong young leaders. And that's why he was in touch with even organizations like RAM, which was an underground organization that many people do not know about, that actually was under Malcolm's advisor. So Malcolm was the advisor, so he was advising, and Robert F. Williams was also the advisor for that organization. So this is very important. These were the street actors who were the real leadership, who Malcolm understood would actually take the struggle somewhere else so that King and others could not control or contain it anymore. And so it's very important to understand that was his orientation. So that's all I have to say.
I just want to say one more thing on the with respect to the point of the issue of dirty laundry. When Malcolm gave us that reference, his example, what he was talking about is a major influential leader having a direct conversation with another major influential leader and their argument, which can get used to play these groups against each other. That's very different from a very public individual being questioned by one of their constituents or someone who's a part of the community, etc. Very fundamentally different than two prominent leaders taking shots at each other. And I think that a lot of times people will use examples like that to pressure us into a political quietism. But I think we got to understand that the example he gave us for airing out dirty laundry was like these very influential individuals who were having a direct argument, taking shots and insulting each other,
Thank you for this clarification. Helga, we have another question
Yes, first of all, thank you for all this interesting lecture. And there is very many thoughts in my brain now because I'm listening to you and thinking about at the same time it's going on in my brain how to reflect on the European situation. So, but this would be another lecture to give to transport all these things or to explain maybe also to you the situation here, which is really also different from there. But yeah, we can see many parallels also and learn from you a lot. So I want to add one thing about what the sister asked about feminism and what you said also. And the second, my second one is a real question about Muslim class struggle, if we can call it like this. So for the first one about the feminist issue, I want to say that in fact we can look into history and we will see the roots of that so-called feminism also there in the global south and in the fighting of the women in the global south. And if we look especially at Muslim women, so we see, as you mentioned, Mariam Ghazali, I think, yeah, one of you mentioned her. And she was one of the women, she made her own organization, her own woman organization. And she was very successful with it. And on the other hand, we have the Palestinian women who were the first among the groups fighting against Israeli and British colonialism. It was a woman group. And she was fighting, and this group was fighting and organizing and being an example for a lot of southern groups fighting against colonialism. And this should be also important for us if we look at the question of leadership, to look at the woman in the struggles. On the one hand, and on the other hand, also what is concerning the social questions, also in which women are always engaged. For example, Mariam Ghazali also, she said when she was married, she said to this man who wanted to marry her, okay, I will marry her, but I want to be in my political work first. So this is my condition, yes, my condition before I marry you. So this is for me more important, my work on the Ummah. And yeah, we should look at this woman. So this is not a thing what the Western women invented. In fact, they looked also from there, I think. Okay, there would be a lot of things to say for this, but I don't want to get deeper. On the other hand, about the question about Muslim class struggles, so I think it was Hannibal, he said that in fact we also as Muslim, we lead or we continue running the rule of capitalism because we are working in the system every day and we are going to work. So if we take it with the word, in fact, capitalism, if we think about leftist strategies in this issue, it would be very interesting for me to know what about class fight in America, in your area. What about Muslim people engaged in
Unions.
In unions, yes, or not unions, because there is also again the question of organization to put, Muslim organization to put, because I think, yeah, it's a true thing. If we talk about how to change system, yeah, this is right to think about solidarity practically also in the area of work. There is, for example, a possibility, yeah, if we see all the people working in Africa and bringing up all these things, what we need, what we use here in Europe and in America, in our computers, in our handies and all the things, and these people, they're striking or having protests and maybe having solidarity protests here also. So this is a fact. With this also the system can be confronted, yeah. And how is Muslim people dealing in this? Do you have some experience in your area? So thank you very much.
Maybe Isra will begin to answer because you have to leave. You said you have to leave, so you can begin to answer.
Yes, thank you. I apologize. I wasn't able to get the full question, but I think what I gleaned for the first part was really about the role of Muslim women and also about the feminism question. And I think again, just going back to the landscape of like mainstream American Muslim activism, and even maybe in your context as well. I think when we just consider mainstream activism, there is a lot of the issues of like women issues and also like men as well. It's like focused on within these like, you know, these cultural American wars that really don't matter if you are in like in a militant Muslim community. So I think the examples you mentioned of like Muslim women being active in militant struggle and having political leadership is really, really important. But we also need to make sure that we frame this question within the correct context. So when we speak about these issues about Muslim women inclusion, that is incredibly important, especially for like the political leadership, for militant Muslim leadership. To ask the question, what are the roles of Muslim women under capitalism? When racial capitalism basically destroys Muslim men, how do Muslim women then come and take up the space? And there's a lot of examples, geographic spaces we can look towards for that. And so I think for my experience as well, because like my point of entry was into a lot of like nonprofit work and whatnot, I think I would always be confused about how easily the language of militant women and the place of women in struggle would be so easily co-opted, because it was usually used to describe, you know, women being treated badly and within the nonprofit sector, or, you know, cultural wars between women and men that had nothing to do actually with militant active struggles against empire. So this is the kind of context we want to make sure that we situate. And I really appreciate you asking that, because just it's not enough. It's not enough interventions from Muslim women asking these questions as what are actually our roles within militant struggle, and then how do we take that up? So I think I would love to, like, for sure after this webinar, to speak with, you know, the women of Dar Al Janub a little bit more about, you know, how we can have these like broader conversations and what are the examples and the geographic kind of spaces that we look to. I apologize, I wasn't able to get like the last part of your question though.
You mean the one about the Muslim class struggle?
Oh, okay.
I should repeat it again?
No, that's it. Yeah, I think that way. As example.
Okay.
It's okay.
Tanzeen or Hannibal, please.
I mean, I would say it's I would say it's important. It's a definitely important issue for Muslims to deal with, because the way the world is organized right now, you know, labor and the exploitation of labor is the primary driving force to when we do what time we wake up, what time we go to sleep, what we eat, where we go during the day. Like, so much of our lives are being determined by our position within the labor structure of capitalism. So it's absolutely a fundamental question for Muslims to deal with, because it's something that's determining people's lives, you know. And I think that you know, how can I say, like, I don't know if it's a question of solidarity as much as it is a question of organizing ourselves, because, you know, we're all playing a role in the capitalist structure. And if we're able to organize ourselves to function differently, and you know, I don't know, impede the system in some way, etc. I guess that's solidarity, self-organizing. I'm not sure. You know, I think that where it becomes challenging is the way that people identify. So you have a lot of people that are involved with the labor struggle who are very invested in the idea and the identity of a worker, which I find to be very problematic for a lot of reasons. Number one, first and foremost, because of the history of slavery here, that I come from a history of slavery. So there's workers and slaves here. So this, you know, a lot of the concepts that are focused around workers really don't remain true or apply to a slave position or ex-slave status, or you know, people who come from history of slavery. There is also a booming prison industry that is also you know, in the same way that the slave plantations of old affected the labor market. Prisons have a similar way that they affect the labor market, but it's different. It's not the same as plantations. There's a lot of differences, but you know, so these are some of the issues that I have with the way that a lot of you know, Marxists and socialists approach the issue of class struggle, approach the issue of, you know, labor struggles, etc., economic struggles, etc. And then even above that, to me, is the question of identity. Like, am I a worker? No, I'm not a worker. I'm a Muslim. So, you know, my first primary identification of myself has to be through Islam. It has to be through the what Allah created for me and intended for me, which wasn't. He didn't create me to be a worker. He didn't create me to drive forward industry. You know, that's not the purpose for which I was created. And so I don't identify as a worker. Do I work? Yeah, I work very hard, you know, but I don't identify as a worker. And I think that's important when it comes to your bigger picture of how you're going to deal with the problem. You know, I think also the issue comes up with relation to, you know, Islam allows for people to be rich. It's not vulgar. It's not wrong for people to get rich. It's not evil in and of itself, right? Wealth is one of the blessings from Allah, but you know, it's how it's being organized. It's that people are not accountable to it, etc. That's problematic. But if you're taking a Marxist perspective, then you're already sort of changing halal and haram, you know, and so that can be, you know, that can be problematic for Muslims, depending on, you know, which direction you go with that. But it's important to understand that it's prayer and deen that should be the fundamental characterizer of our lives, the fundamental determiner of our schedules and our flow, the flow of traffic. You know, when you see all that traffic during rush hour, the traffic is really supposed to be during the prayer times. You know, it's not supposed to be traffic during rush hour. It's supposed to be traffic during salat times. And you know, these things become very important when you really consider them as a Muslim. You know, we're driven by so many forces that don't have nothing to do with Islam. And so in our approach to dealing with the problems, we want to keep a holistic Islamic perspective, you know, that we're Muslims, we're believers, we're not cogs in the machine, we're not workers, we're not, you know, raw materials, we're not, etc. But I think that, you know, I think it maybe goes without saying that if Muslim majority countries were organized according to Islam, it would not be possible for capitalists to function the way they do today, right? Like the sister mentioned about the materials that go into the computers. If it wasn't for the sake of the constant perpetuated war in the Congo, then it wouldn't be possible for Apple to make so much money on their products. It wouldn't be possible. If you know, you look at any number of societies, right? Any number of societies where there's large Muslim populations, those are actually critical locations for either extracting raw materials or processing them, right? If Muslims were organized in their own societies and in control of their own societies and organized according to Islam and not organized according to capitalism and colonialism, then it wouldn't even be possible for capitalists to exploit the labor of the secular workers. That wouldn't even be possible. The fundamental nature of class struggle would be different if Muslims had Islamic societies. It will be fundamentally different anywhere in the world. Just when you deal with the raw materials and the processing, Islam would play a major role in what products are available, what industries are possible, etc. Just by organizing the society of places where there's large Muslim populations.
Thank you. Tanzim?
Yeah. I want to put I'm still echoing. Okay. I want to just add that the first the question about feminism of the global South and so on. The person I had mentioned is an important figure of Zainab al-Ghazali, who originally had a history in when she was secular in feminism, but when she had an Islamist turn, she rejected Western feminism altogether, and she had joined and organized a women's movement and was in close conversation continuously with Hassan al-Banna and Said Qutb. And so I really encourage our listeners to read her book, Return of the Pharaoh, and how much dedication she had for the cause of Islam. In fact, when she became a teacher and educator, she talked about Islamic values for women and was promoting that and was condemning Western feminism as a solution in Egypt. So it's very important, actually. She's an inspiration for much of the Islamic strugglers who are women in Palestine and Gaza and Syria and other places of the world, where she was very sure that the solutions for women were in the Sharia, in the Sunnah, in the Quran. And she was very sure of that. Having said that, one of the things we have to realize is that secular capitalism promoted a very particular kind of structure of gender. So that is something no one who's well-read would deny. But we're starting to say that when we force a large majority of Muslim women who are subaltern or Black, when we force them to articulate their problem through the discourse of feminism, then we force them to go outside of the paradigm of Islam to resolve their issues, to resolve what they're encountered with. So when we think about, if you look at a text by Hortense Spillers, she's literally talking about that the condition of the slave is that they do not even have their ability to be in their own bodies is taken away from them. That's what it means to be in modern chattel slavery. The ability to be in your own bodies, let alone other things like women's rights and agency and the right to property. The slaves who were brought to America did not have access to their own bodies to be themselves. That's called ungendering. So how can women like that, in quotations, or men like that, talk through the language of feminism, a language which already assumes that the subject can speak for herself because she's autonomous? How? So this is a theoretical crisis for feminism. It's my challenge to feminism. It's the challenge of Hortense Spiller's to feminism. It's the challenge of other thinkers who are deep about this impossibility of someone who's been reduced to flesh to speak the language of human beings whose humanity is constructed against the body of the slave who has been forcibly ungendered. That's one. Number two, when we ask the subaltern women in Afghanistan to speak the language of feminism, they're also being forced to speak the language of those women in there who are oppressing them in the first place. So this is why feminism as a language and as a discourse is not the language of those who are struggling for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we also, the third thing I want to remind our listeners is that Europe has a horrible history of femicide, a horrible history of witch hunting against women in a systemic way. This is why modern European patriarchy has a specific structure and women there have a specific history. We cannot be made, Islam cannot be made to be blamed for what Europe did to its own population through witch hunting. We do not in Islam have a history of witch hunting at all. When Islam came, they immediately gave important
Tanzine, I don't know if you're frozen or if we're just not getting audio, but
I think both.
yeah, like, and I don't know if you can hear me, but a couple of minutes ago, your sound went out.
Okay, we lost Tanzine. Okay, maybe we should wait some minutes.
Okay.
But I think Isra, you have to go. Or think.
Yeah.
Okay. So for Isra, thank you for joining us. Thank you to be our key speaker in this lecture, and we will have, inshallah, another discussions.
Yes.
And also discussions between the our sisters here, with, that you connect with them.
Yes.
Yes. So see you and goodbye.
Yeah, thank you so much again. I really enjoyed being a part of this webinar. Again, we don't see this type of we don't have this type of information here. So this is really refreshing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
But Hannibal, don't leave us.
I think Tanzine is trying to get back on.
Okay.
Well, any other questions while we wait?
Yes. Frage. Here's a question.
Hi, Hannibal. Thank you for speaking today. I myself a Black person in Austria. I'm not a Muslim, and I have a question. Like I've been, you explained that you found the solution to your problems first in anarchism, then in Black nationalism, and now in Islam. I have learned a lot about respect of other people through anarchism. I've learned a lot about self-respect for my own history through Black nationalism. I do see a lot of the values that I try to live reflect on Islam. I myself am not sure if I would like to further follow that, because I know that we have also had other religions, other nationalities, other understandings of the world in Africa already before Islam. So I wanted to ask you how you came to believe in Islam as the proper solution for yourself. Why do you think there are no other ways, or why do you think that's the best way for you to live as a Black person, as a Muslim? I don't want to identify you, but like I just want to.
No, yeah, you're right. You're right. So I think I got your question. Inshallah. I would start out with saying Islam was not my first stop. You know, I studied a lot of different things in my journey to Islam, and you know, culturally, the idea, as you mentioned, that there's a lot of different things, a lot of different traditions that come out of Africa, that I found that to be very appealing. You know, initially in my younger years, that was kind of like, for me, that made the most sense. It was like, you know, I'm a Black person, I'm in America, I have to shake off this slave mentality of Black African American, embrace, you know, my African history and traditions, etc., in order to really come to life as a full being, you know, as a full African, or, you know, as someone freeing themselves out of slavery. And so in order to comment on that, I suppose I have to give some context, because I'm in the Bay Area, which is, you know, somewhat unique from a lot of America, in that people here in this area pride themselves on diversity. Like multiculturalism is like a big value in the area where I'm at, in you know, in this little kind of pocket region. And you have diverse you have very diverse population here. You have people from all over Africa here. You have people from all over Asia. You have people from all over the Americas. You know, you have you got all kind of different backgrounds. And then even more specifically in San Francisco, which is like just 15-20 minutes from me, there's a university where they have an Africana Studies program, which is sort of like one of the epicenters of Afrocentrism here. And by Afrocentrism, I mean like specifically a cultural history that goes back to like the 70s or 80s, specific kind of tradition of people that consider themselves Afrocentrists. And one thing they do is, you know, they're what you might call syncretists, because they weave and match and do patchwork with traditions. So they'll take any tradition that they like and pick some part of it that they like and take that and mix it with a totally different tradition in order to come up with like a composite African cultural tradition. And that's actually quite popular here. One of the major problems with that is it's like you're isolating traditions away from their context. And so you have people practicing like trace elements of a tradition of a certain tribe or what have you, in such a way as to where they lose meaning. They lose the meaning of the traditions they come from. They lose the understanding, the social significance and understanding, etc. So it's kind of like there's a big culture of like pick and choose whatever you want. You know what I mean? You can pick and choose anything from Africa, appropriate it, and because you're African American, you don't know really which part of Africa your people come from, or maybe they were bred at some point like animals and they came from every part of Africa. You don't know. So you can just appropriate anything you want. And so people, they just take what they like from different traditions. But if we really look at the history in Africa, and if we take some time to make ourselves familiar with people on their terms, we take time to make ourselves familiar with Kenyans. Like, for example, I grew up next door to a Kenyan family. So from early on, I knew that African wasn't one thing. I knew that, African wasn't like just one homogenous place that, all Black people come from. That, people have different traditions. And and I had some sensitivity to that because I grew up, next to this family who they were fairly new to America. So, the parents spent all their life in Kenya, and the children my age, were already, kids. They were already sort of like big kids when they came to America. So they were very, they were very in touch with the culture that they come from, etc. Because you have some Africans who maybe their parents grew up in Africa, but their children grew up here. So they have name and features and maybe some language, but they don't have like that much connection. So you might think they're kind of the same, but anyway, so I grew up next to this Kenyan family. And so, they would like show me videos and pictures and different things and kind of like teach me stuff about Kenya and what have you. And then, over the years, I've been very close to people from different countries in Africa, which gave me the perspective to understand that many of the things that African Americans were practicing here as Afrocentrists were like alien to these people that I knew who were from Africa. These were like things that were incoherent to them. That didn't make any sense to them. What they considered a t-shirt was like some ceremonial garb to Afrocentrists here. You know what I mean? Because people were putting meanings where they don't match, right? And this was important to me because, it was important to me because I could never fully buy into this idea of like a magic, fantastical Africa, which is what the Afrocentrists believe in. They believe in these ideas of, that everyone was a king and a queen, and everyone was rich and lived in these, you know, plush gardens and this kind of thing. And so I could never buy into that kind of thinking because I had real relationships with different people from different parts of Africa. And so, so like, you know, as I started to engage with some of those traditions, I would always kind of like there'd always be something that would give me pause because I had these relationships, you know. And you know, and then looking at some of the history of different traditions that get mixed in, you have to recognize that these traditions that at least here people mix together were actually like mortal enemies in Africa. You know what I mean? Like some of these traditions that come from different tribes, that come from tribes that were killing each other for generations. But people here will mix the two traditions as if it's one and the same, right? And then you talk to some people who come from some of those climates. Some people who are very tribal, or they're very like ethnocentric in their specific ethnicity or their particular, you know, linguistic group or what have you, right? And then and you know, you'd have to recognize the reality of the fact that there's not the kind of unity that would make it easy to sort of pick a tradition or to be, you know, loyal or adherent to a tradition. And then you'd have to recognize that what makes these people sisters or brothers is not being African. Being African didn't make them sisters and brothers. It didn't stop them from fighting wars against each other. It didn't stop them from enslaving one another. Not to the way that we understand slavery today, but taking each other captive, forcing each other into servitude, etc. That was happening. That was very much happening. And that was the history of people that considered each other as a different type of being. It's not just you speak a different language. I'm this thing and you're that thing. And we're fundamental different types of beings with different gods, different creators, different laws, all of that, fundamentally different. And those people were fighting each other, killing each other. And a lot of that is what created even the possibility for Europeans to come in and capture so many Africans, is because they were already divided, fighting wars against each other. And that's what Europeans took advantage of, right? So when we think about Blackness as a unifying force, it can't be said to exist in Africa. It can't be said to exist historically as a unifying force before slavery. Blackness and Africanness as a unifying force only comes into existence after slavery in a response to being slaves, right? And that comes into relevance and coherence and makes sense as a concept to us after we've been enslaved, right? Because before enslavement, we were fundamentally different types of beings. We didn't consider each other as the same type of being. But before slavery, Islam already made them as sisters and brothers. Islam already made brothers out of enemies before slavery. Islam already made sisters and brothers out of these people who consider each other fundamentally different, right? Islam is the only unifying force that gives rights to everyone, right? Because the other unifying force, which gives meaning to Blackness and Africanness, is slavery. That's the unifying force of Blackness and Africanness, is the history of slavery, which does not give equal rights to anyone, which does not give dignity and honor to us, right? So we then lean towards, Africanness and Blackness as a potential platform of unity, a potential platform of struggle, etc. And not to say that it isn't, but my point, what I'm trying to get at, is that, before Islam, Africans weren't considering each other the same thing, right? When Islam was introduced into certain places, it made brothers out of enemies. It made family out of enemies. It united people and gave people a common set of rights to adhere to. It gave people dignity. It gave everyone dignity in the eyes of one another, right? It flattens out the hierarchies of, princes, kings, and, royal families, etc. It flattens out those hierarchies. It creates a platform for people to truly be equal. Not equal in the sense that, I have $1, you have $1, but equal in the sense that we're all given a chance for a fulfilling life. We're all given a chance for respect and dignity and honor. We all have rights that can't be alienated, that can't be dismissed. It gives all of us, rights on each other. It gives all of us, walaikum assalam. It gives all of us a common recourse to resolve our conflicts and disputes. Whereas before, there was no common platform. And even after. So before slavery, after slavery, aside from Islam, there is no common recourse for Black people to deal with conflicts, deal with problems, etc. There's no common legal structure for them to be accountable to. There's nothing to give order to the societies that would allow unity, that would allow cohesion, coexistence, that would allow for people to live fulfilling lives, etc. Right? Without Islam, there isn't unity. There is different gods, different creators, and fundamentally different types of creatures who are fundamentally at war and at odds with each other. And that is the nature of African history. That is the nature of, slavery. That's, tribes are fighting each other, taking each other captives. Europeans see that moment as an opportunity to take advantage of all of them. They create a system of exploitation based on phenotype, based on the features and how a person looks. That's what unifies warring tribes, because now Europeans see you as the same thing. So now you're the same thing. So now you're in a common struggle for freedom and liberation, etc. And that's what makes you African. Otherwise, there's no need for a concept of Africa. There's no need for a concept of such a huge landmass with so many divergent groups at war with each other. How would you call it one thing? It wouldn't make sense to call it one thing until you get people unified and grouped into this category based on slavery, right? So Africans were not Africans before slavery. They were Fulani, Hausa, Igbo, they were Ikweri, they were these different tribes who had fundamental different cosmologies, different deities, etc. Right? The only real platform for Black unity, for us to be equal, for us to see each other as sister, brother, etc., is to have a unifying platform of rights and values, is to have a unifying platform that says we're all entitled to certain rights, we're all entitled to a certain level of decency and respect and honor, etc. That's the only platform for unity, right? And the only system that offers that to Black people in a meaningful way, in a sincere way, is Islam, right? If we look at any other system that offers unity for Black people, it's based on false divisions, hierarchies, and exploitations, right? So for me, it's like reasoning. It's like, okay, how in the world are we going to get Crips and Bloods to stop killing each other? They're already Christians, so Christianity ain't going to do it. They're already poor, so poverty ain't gonna do it. They're already black, so blackness ain't gonna do it. You know what I mean? Like, what's really gonna bring these warring gangs together? There has to be something that causes them to see each other as one and the same. There has to be a platform of a unifying set of ethics, rules, laws, and ways of resolving conflicts. There has to be a unifying set of rights so that when I'm personally inclined to be prejudiced against Tanzim, there's a common law that then Marcus can bring up and say, hey, Hannibal, you're not giving Tanzim his rights. Well, I hate Tanzim, but okay, but he still has his rights, regardless of how you look at him and conflict you guys have with each other. He still has his rights. And those rights are the platform for which creates cohesion. That's what creates order in a society, right? Aside from that, now we're thinking as free individuals, right? Aside from that, as free individuals, without a force of organized slavery and colonialism, without a force of organized oppression at the hands of European superpowers, without that, given, you know, a landscape of fairly equal powers and, you know, fairly equal resources, etc., there's nothing unifying us. There's nothing stopping us from going to constant war against each other until we just obliterate each other. Islam is the only system that offers order. It's the only system that really offers order to everyone, that really offers rights to everyone. And so, you know, I think a lot of times we lean towards culture and we lean towards certain history out of an inferiority complex, out of a sense of feeling humiliated by our status in society as Black people. And so we lean towards things as a crutch for our being dishonored, as a crutch for feeling, you know, wounded and vulnerable by the ways that we're humiliated and dishonored. So as a crutch, we're leaning on culture and we're leaning on things that are fairly meaningless. But when we really start thinking about how we're going to get out the situation, how can I rely on a stranger to work together with a stranger? How can I rely on my brother? How can I rely on my brother to hold tight to the truth, to the plan, to the cause, when it's going to hurt him more than it hurts me? How can I rely on him? You have to start looking for a system of organizing yourself, a system of unity that's going to allow for everyone to have the same rights. That's going to allow for disputes to be resolved in a orderly way. That's going to allow for, you know, that's going to allow for, you know, the unification of a society. That's going to create a kind of motivation where everyone sees that their well-being is tied up in the well-being of the others around them. You know, there's no other system that offers that for us, right? And for Black people, we desperately need a system of organizing ourselves. Because we're not organized, because we're not using a unified system of organizing ourselves, we get played against each other, we get dispersed and divided, we get dealt with one at a time. We don't get to make the proper use of our resources, of our capabilities, etc. You know what I mean? So even if you got away from the moral aspects of it and the spiritual aspects of it, even if you were merely thinking materially on a practical material level, there needs to be a unifying system, right? And so for me, I explored a lot of unifying systems before I came to Islam. You know, I explored socialism, communism, anarchism, feminism. I explored nationalism. I explored intercommunalism. I explored, you know, a number of things that people purported to be this, you know, this is what's going to get us out of slavery. This is what's going to get us out of capitalism. And I explored those things and I found them to be lacking in critical areas. And one critical area or another, they're fundamentally lacking what's necessary to make enemies. Okay? This is what we're talking about. When you're talking about Black liberation, you're talking about Bloods and Crips becoming unified as sisters and brothers. You're talking about people who've been killing each other for generations, looking at one another as sister and brother, right? Which system is going to offer that to them? And you know, my assertion is there's no other system that's capable of offering that to them besides Islam. So by that very fundamental nature, even just on a practical level, if we just ignore spirituality, which I'm not ignoring spirituality, but if let's say we do, and we just look at very materialistic needs, the very materialistic needs of the body, it still makes the most sense for Black people. Because it's a unified system of equality. It's a unified system of order, of organizing yourself and resolving chaos and creating order and quality of life for people.
Thank you, Hannibal, and thank you, Santiago, for the question, and thank you, Hannibal. We are far away from the wolf and the foxes, but it's okay. Good. It's very good to have the space to discuss these important things.
And please tell me if if there's some aspect I didn't address or if I answered the question good, because it's such an important question to me, you know, that he asked. So, mashallah.
Yeah, I think we are.
I'm very thankful for your answer. I mean, I also disagree with all of that. Like I've seen Africana studies, heard of it. I've heard of this picking and choosing of different cultures. I also don't like that much. I like my father comes from the Congo, so I have a direct connection to a nation, to a culture, to an understanding of life. That's something I do want to explore for myself. I also see that a lot of Black people do find Islam, find a way of living through that and leaving all of the things that you might call African or all their former cultures behind for Islam. And that's something I just struggle with. I wanted to hear your perspective on that. And I thank you very much for it.
Yeah, no problem. And it is a struggle, you know, and what I would add to that is that I don't think that we're supposed to abandon our cultures. We're not supposed to abandon our traditions, but just the ones that are clearly bad for us, right? We should, any of our traditions that are really good for our people, we should keep them and honor them, you know. So it's and I think some people, to our detriment, I think some people and we have this problem, at least here in America, where people convert to Islam as in converting away from Blackness, as in converting away from their roots and their traditions. And I don't want to encourage that either, because I think that's problematic, you know, to say the least. But like, you know, many of our of the original and traditional cultures of Africa have a lot of really, really good components and really good things in them. So it's not merely about just dropping who you are and what you come from, but just being like a vessel and carrying some of the medicine for your people and carrying some of the good things that can resolve the dysfunctions that you recognize. Not that some other culture or some other ethnicity is telling you, hey, this is what's wrong with your people. You got to stop doing this and that. No, but you know what your community needs, you know what your people need, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, and you know, you're most qualified to see like where these things need to be applied. And so, you know, I just wanted to make that point too.
Thank you, Hannibal. Tanzine is back. Hello.
Yes.
I would suggest, the time is running, I would suggest that we should come to an end. And thank you to Isra, and thank you to Hannibal and Tanzine. Thank you for so much for this comprehensive assessment. We have to translate, discuss, and confront us with all this input that you gave us. And also bring it in a situation like here in Europe, but a lot of things are familiar and some are not, of course. And we should end here in this our conversation, but we should continue at another time in another setup to pick up different thoughts and discussions. So thank you so much. Maybe a final statement from you, Hannibal and Tanzine, or Tanzine, if you want to continue where we lost you, maybe it's if you want to put some words at this point where you broke up.
Yeah, I think I was just simply trying to answer the question of the sister who had asked questions about feminism of the global south, and had explained how for a vast majority of Muslim women, is going to be very difficult, or it's going to be forced when they're forced to make themselves legible through the discourse of feminism. And it's much more almost natural to respond to it, even though it might be difficult at first, to respond to those crises that Muslim women face through the discourse of Islam. There would be much more honor. I mean, I'm a father, I have a daughter myself, and one of the things I'm trying to teach is teaching the significance of having knowledge about her rights in Islam. Therefore, no one can trick her into believing some other thing that is being passed as Islam. So it's very important that we have a very strong education of our women and our sisters, and also the rights that men have and men have to give in the way they conduct themselves in Muslim societies. So the same with my boys, they should understand as they grow up that the knowledge that they respect the most is the Islamic knowledge. Now, having said that, the other thing I wanted to bring up was how Europe has a very distinct and unique tradition of destroying women and treating them as property, which did not happen in the Islamic world large scale level. I'm not saying there aren't abuses. I'm not saying there are no mistakes. It would be unwise to think that, and insensitive. But Europe's mechanism of witch hunting, which has a very specific orientation, created the landscape from within which European feminism emerged. There's no way for us, no reason for us to inherit Europe's problem as our problem. This is the same way that Europeans often blame Arabs for their position against the state of Israel and try to say that European anti-Semitism now is a part of Arab anti-Semitism. It's not. It's a very different thing. Similarly, European patriarchy is not our business. It's their problem. It's the problem of Europe. And we do have, it's true, Islamic concept of leadership, prophetic model, and in which men do have a certain position and perspective. And that for that, it's not my position, it's the position of the Quran and the Sunnah to organize how these different roles and things are organized from pre-colonial eras, not colonial patriarchy, etc. etc. It's pre-colonial from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So I wanted to just say those things. The other thing that I forgot to explain was the question of class, which the sister also brought up, the significance of class and class struggle. I agree with my brother Hannibal that the identity of worker or workerism is backdated, and it doesn't allow us to understand our true dimension in the antagonism with secularism. that we have as Muslims as the Islamicate or the Islamic world. However, it is important to understand the contradictions and the relationship between labor and capital. We're living in this, and so we have to also understand that Islam does not necessarily promote secular socialism, but it does consider interest or riba as haram. So an economy in which riba or interest is forced is largely an economy that is antithetical to Islamic system. An interest rate and interests are things that Muslims from the beginning of being Muslim have rejected as a system that is based on exploitation. So at the ontological level, Islam promotes systems that is outside of the paradigm of capitalist secularism. So the question of interest, and the second question is exploitation. Exploitation is often, today Muslims misunderstand what exploitation is. We need to be educated on this. Exploitation is not just moral exploitation, it's economic exploitation, which means labor gets hidden from the laborer himself. We all have labor power, and our labor power is being utilized for free, a certain portion, even those of us who do not come from slavery, for the purposes of giving free work, which then is used to create surplus labor, will create surplus value through surplus labor power. And this is something that is necessary for capitalism to sustain itself in order to create profit. And as a result, we have a structure in which exploitation is necessary. So in other words, when Muslims understand these two concepts, that interest is foundational in capitalism, there is no capitalism without interest, and there is no capitalism without exploitation. As a result, capitalism becomes a system, an economic system that is completely not okay for Muslims, largely speaking. Unfortunately, we have something called Islamic economics, which tried to camouflage capitalism by halalifying it. And it is very easy for someone who understands the details of capitalism to see that when they say this or that thing in interest free, the name of interest just is changed to some other name, some other fee, but it's actually interest that the Muslim is being forced to pay. So we're very interested in understanding capitalism in this robust way and trying to understand a solution that will try to be a way to go away from interest, which is haram, and from exploitation, which is also not allowed. So those are the 2 points I would like to make about the question of class, about the question of struggle against the relationship between labor and capital.
Thank you, Tanzeen. Thank you. Do you want to give us a final statement to close?
My own final statement is that I really want to thank the people, the audience who participated. I would like to thank all the viewers who are going to be watching this once it's shared with the public. And I want to thank my co-panelists, Hannibal and Sister Isra. And I would like to thank you, Marcus, for moderating this conversation. And I would like to continue to have conversations with Dar Al Janub. And we highly respect your constituency and the struggle that you have there. And we're willing to also help in any way that we can with whatever it is that organizations like yours need, inshallah. So Jazakallah khair, and thank you very much for the platform.
Thank you very much. Hannibal, a final statement from you.
Yeah, alhamdulillah, it's an honor to be in conversation with you all. Really appreciate the engagement, the questions from the audience, and helping us work through these ideas, because this is how we refine our efforts. This is how we get to clarity, and it's just an honor to be engaging with other people who take up the struggle. We really admire your efforts towards the liberation of Palestine. That's something that's very close to our hearts. Actually, that's how me and Tanzeen met. I wanted to mention that earlier. That's how we actually met, was at a protest outside the Israeli consulate. And we find that too many people are too soft on such an important issue. So that's something that, you know, we really appreciate about you all, and look forward to working with you more and deeper and further, inshallah.
Thank you to you. It was a great honor to hear your lecture and to be in contact with you. And the most important thing that we feel is in Dar Al Janub, that we feel that we heard something from a collective, from people who come together and came together and changed their ideas and put it in one voice and one message. This is what we lost in our societies here, that we have a lot of opinions and individuals who have maybe good ideas, but they are not able to bring it in a collective way. And the only thing what can, in this world we can survive is a community. And then people come together. And in this we can learn very much from you. And in your activism, in your Milestones Journal platform. So again, it was a great honor to hear you and to got this input. And we want to continue our discussions, inshallah. I want to mention that we have in next month we have two Zoom lectures with Ward Churchill. And we were the inspiration came also from you. I want to say that there is a Milestones lecture on YouTube with Ward Churchill. And we have two lectures on the 14th and of the 21st March. The topic is colonialism as genocide, the concept of colonialism. And the second is the little Eichmanns, Vienna. Here was his office from this person. Responsibility and the question of innocence in societies of the global north. Yes, we hope that you from Milestones would join this Zoom conference and give your input.
Inshallah.
So thank you to all the participants. Thank you to all the people here in Dar Al Janub who were with us. And thank you for the questions and the answers. And yes, last but not least, thank you greetings to Israel, Hannibal and Tanzeen. Thank you so much. Ma salama, and see you inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Wassalam.